Okay. Whoops. One second. Good morning, everyone. So I thought that today we'll do something a little bit different. Not completely different, but the last few weeks and next week, we've been discussing the topic of daily struggles and the strategies that come with it to achieve emotional well-being and navigating the various daily normal struggles that we have and so on. But I thought that since tonight is Purim, and you know how much I love the Jewish calendar, yes, right. And I thought, there are so many lessons from Purim. Number one, that relate to the topics we've been discussing and others. And also, I think this year it's even more stronger because the Purim story, as we'll see, and the Purim festival is really incredibly relevant today. I'm saying today, meaning as we go through what we're going through now, as a model and a formula of what we as individuals, but also we as a nation sort of are navigating. So what I'm going to try and do is going to highlight some lessons. We're going to go through 7 lessons of Purim. 5 of them relate more to individual, 2 more as a nation.
Yes.
And they come from the story of Purim, the observance of Purim, and so on. However, today is not Purim. Today is called the Fast of Esther, actually. It's the minor fast of Esther. I did get up really early this morning before it started to have a coffee, so I should be okay. But it's not Purim. Purim only, and you only can tap into the...
When does the fast start?
Fast starts at dawn. So different to Yom Kippur. So in the fast day, there are two fast days during the year that are 24 hours. That's Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, when we mourn the destruction of the temple. All the other minor fast days start from dawn, and depending if it's summer or winter. So right now dawn is very late. It's like 5:30. So I'm up anyways before then. So yeah. So that's why. Yeah. But the actual Purim festival starts tonight. Most of the mitzvot are done tomorrow during the day. So even though you're coming here today, you haven't covered Purim. So we need to see you tomorrow at 9:15 at Ariel Espiridi's house in Vaucluse, where we'll do what we do every time, every Purim. Do a quick Megillah reading, like really fast, and then also Mishloach Manot, and share some more Purim insights and so on. So, I thought what we do is, first of all, just make sure everyone has context. We'll give a quick crash course in Jewish history, and just understand the actual basic story of Purim. Even though it's what we call a long Megillah, but there is a basic story. So the Purim story takes place, does anyone know when it takes place? Historically? Yeah, no, in Shusha, but what period in history? Persia, but when does the play take place? I mean, that's what I meant.
Sorry, what is
When did the Purim story take place? It's just interesting to know the calendar. Like, yeah, a long time ago for sure. So it takes place. It takes place in the 5th century before the Common Era. So no, before the Common Era. So like BC, in other words, right? Yeah. By the way, interestingly enough, although it takes place such a long time ago, we actually know. I mean, I've never been to Iran, but we actually know where Mordechai and Esther are buried. And there are people that visit. I mean, there's still, as you know, there's still modern day Iran is Persia, right? And before the fall of the Shah, there was people used to travel there, and there was a thriving Jewish community. People would go. I've met people that have gone to the gravesite of Mordechai and Esther, especially on Purim, which is quite fascinating. But today there's still a Jewish community there, quite an active Jewish community actually, as active as they can be. But they have a rabbi and they have schools. It's actually a fascinating phenomenon. But they do have it, and there are people there that still visit Mordechai and Esther's gravesite on Purim tomorrow. Pray there on Purim, which is a fascinating thing. So yes, so it takes place in the 5th century BCE. Achashverosh is the king. Yeah, I always say BCE, Common Era. Okay. So Achashverosh was the king at the time. Okay, just to run through it quickly. So Achashverosh is the king of the whole inhabited world at the time, a very, very powerful king. And then the Jewish people that were then in Persia, because they had migrated from Babylonia, which is modern-day Iraq, after the destruction of the first temple. So when the first temple was destroyed, they were sent into exile for 70 years. There was a word of God through the prophets that it would be a 70-year exile. The problem is that the calculation of the 70 years wasn't clear, right? Because the Jews went into exile in stages. So how you worked out the 70 years wasn't clear. And this is relevant to the story of Purim because Achashverosh, who then was the king, had taken over from Persia, he'd overrun Persia, made a calculation, and it was the 3rd year of his reign, and he came to the conclusion that the 70 years were up, and the Jews didn't return to Israel and didn't have a second temple yet. So therefore he said, well, that's the case, God's obviously forgotten about them, and we can celebrate. I have no threat on my head that there's going to be another temple or a revolt by the Jews, or whatever the case is. So he made this famous banquet, which is the opening of the Megillah's story. Right? There are lots of stuff. I mean, there's lots to talk about the Purim story, but just I want to go through it briefly so we understand. Now, what happened was at that banquet, he ended up executing his wife Vashti, and then he, and he was looking for a queen, and Esther, he didn't know she was Jewish, but Esther was forced away from Mordechai, and she became actually the queen of Persia. Then Haman came along the scene. Haman was a villain, terrible person. He was he rose to great prominence. He became the prime minister, the second in command to the king, and he had this crazy egocentric perspective. Then he enacted that everyone has to bow down to him, and Mordechai wouldn't bow down to him, and he was enraged. And then he decided to plot to kill the entire Jewish people. I say entire Jewish people because they were spread out in the 127 provinces of Achashverosh. And he plotted to kill them all. How did he do it? So this is actually important to the story because people often mix up the sequence of the story of Purim. So I'm just going to share with you so you know what it is and why the day of Purim is the day. So Purim is on the 14th of Adar, right? When the decree was made, it was actually just before Pesach, like it was a month from now. Yeah. And he made the decree and it went out, and everyone knew that there will be a huge massacre on the 13th of Adar, which is today. So in other words, just picture this, it's a month from now, and he made this decree that in 11 months he drew lots, and that's the month that came out. And he made the decree that on the 13th of Adar, which Achashverosh signed off on, there would be this permission for everyone to take up arms and to kill Jews. That was the decree. So it was going to happen this is the date, it was going to happen the 13th of Adar. Jews sprang into action. Mordechai asked Esther to see the king. Esther says that first the Jews have to gather, they have to pray, they have to reconnect to God, which happens over the 3-day fast around Pesach time. And then she goes to the king. Miraculously, the king accepts her and accepts the invitation. She invited Achashverosh and Haman to a banquet. This was actually second day, it was actually Pesach night, Pesach day. Yeah, it wasn't on Purim. We'll see in a second. And at the banquet, he says to Esther, what do you want? Well, tell me what you want and I'll give it to you. She says, well, what I want is that you should come with Haman tomorrow. By the way, one of the reasons she invited Haman to the banquet as well was to get Achashverosh nervous. The Talmud talks about many reasons. Because he couldn't understand, like, why is he being invited together with Haman? And he was already getting nervous that maybe Haman's plotting something, and then that added to his rage when the whole plan was exposed. And he comes the second day, the second banquet, which is the second day of Pesach, and he asks Esther what she wants. She says, my nation is under stress. A decree has been made. She then reveals that she's actually Jewish. And Achashverosh gets really, really upset, and he says, Mi who's the person that's doing this? And she points to Haman, and she says it's him, right? And at that time, someone told the king that Haman had actually prepared a gallows to hang Mordechai. So Achashverosh says, hang Haman and his 10 sons. And that's what happened. So actually, Haman didn't die in Purim. Haman didn't fall on Purim. I'll explain what Purim is in a minute. But Haman fell, actually, the yahrzeit of Haman, so to speak, is on the second day of Pesach. Just a fun fact, right? That's when Haman was killed. However, there was a problem. Persian law mandated, and this goes into understand what the day of Purim is all about. Persian law mandated that once the king had put his seal to a law, that law couldn't be rescinded. So Achashverosh tells Mordechai, we've got a problem. I signed into law that on the 13th of Adar, 11 months from now, roughly, right? Because they were talking Pesach time, everyone could take up arms and kill Jews. And it still stands. And when there's a chance for anti-Semitism, that people take it, no matter, right? Even though Haman had fell. But he says, what I can do is, I can allow you to make another law that the Jewish people can take up arms and fight back. Right? And that's what happens. Now, so and that law went out, and there was celebration. The Megillah tells us, but although the Jews were celebrating, and we'll get to that in a minute, they were still under tremendous pressure. A whole year almost, 11 months. For 11 months, they had this over their head that there was going to be a war on the 13th of Adar. Now, many non-Jews gave it up because they actually saw, and we'll talk about that later on, what the lesson in that is. They actually said, no, we're not going to fight back. In fact, some of them even became Jewish. But there were plenty of people that would still welcome the opportunity to fight a war with the Jews. And on the 13th of Adar, today, is when there was a war. 11 months after Haman had been killed, there was a war on the 13th of Adar. In fact, I'll tell you a very fascinating thing, just a fun thing, nothing to do with the shir today, but this fast today is called the fast of Esther, the minor fast, right? It's a custom to fast the day before. It's not a very strict fast, but, right? So, why is it called the fast of Esther? So, there used to be an old tradition when Jews went to war, and there was many wars that Jews fought in times of Israel, that when they went to war, the community would fast, because just as a prayer to Hashem that the war should be successful. But the people who obviously didn't fast were the people fighting, because they were exempt from fasting, because you need to be strong to fight. In the story of the war that happened today, the day before Purim, the 13th of Adar, which is today, the Jewish people were all at war. Now, on a war day, you fast, but the problem is that no one could really fast because everyone was fighting. Everyone was under threat. Everyone had to defend themselves. So in fact, the entire Jewish nation was fighting. So therefore, no one was obligated to fast except for one Jew, Esther. She was in the palace, so she was the only Jewish that actually fasted today, right? And that's why, because to remember that fast, it became accustomed to fast, but it became known as the fast of Esther, because she was really the only one that fasted. Anyway, so therefore they won the war. They fought the war. They won the war overwhelmingly, and they celebrated and rested the day later, which was Purim, right? And that's Purim. So Purim is not when Haman fell. Purim is when they won the war, and they were able to rest and celebrate and be relieved that that threat has now been removed. Okay.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yes.
I've lost the context. Why were they celebrating Pesach before Purim?
No, there was no Purim yet in those days.
Oh,
But when...
Then why doesn't Pesach come before?
No, because the story happened on Pesach, but then ended up finishing on Purim, on the 13th of Adar, 11 months later. In other words, Haman was killed on Pesach. But the decree was still there to kill Jews, but the decree was for 11 months from now.
Oh, right.
And then when that happened, right?
Yeah.
Now, it happens to be, so that's this historical sequence, but there happens to be a very great mystical thing behind the whole thing, and that is that the Jewish cycle, right? The Jewish cycle of festivals, we have a funny calendar. So we have Rosh Hashanah, which is the beginning of the year, right? But as you know, the months don't start from Rosh Hashanah. Like in the Torah, there's no names of months, there's numbers. Month 1, month 2, month 3, right? The Tishrei, the month of Rosh Hashanah is not the first month, it's the 7th month. I know it sounds strange, but that's what it is. Rosh Hashanah is the head of the year in terms of the blessings and what Hashem does for the year.
Tishrei is not number one.
No, Tishrei is not number 1, Tishrei is number 7. But it's still Rosh Hashanah. So we're in year 5785 right now, and that finishes Rosh Hashanah time, because the years go by Rosh Hashanah. But the cycle, the Jewish cycle of months go from when we became a nation, which is Nisan, the month of Pesach, right? Therefore, what happens actually is, and there's a great, it's for a different shiur, but there's a great depth on how the festivals all work. There's actually a very great meaning to all the cycles. So actually the first festival in the Jewish cycle is actually Pesach, right? The last festival in the Jewish cycle is Purim. And if we have a few minutes at the end, I'll give you a quick synopsis of why that is. But in fact, and therefore Purim is actually the greatest festival. In fact, I will tell you it needs a bit of explanation and context, but just so you know how great Purim is, the Zohar says that Purim is greater than Yom Kippur. Did you know that? Why? Because it says it on a play of words, but it's got deep meaning to it. Yom Kippur in the Torah is called Yom Kippurim, the Day of Atonement, right? But the word also means Kippurim, which means it's a day like Purim. It doesn't quite get to Purim, but it's like Purim, right? Put it on hold. I'll come back to it hopefully, and I'll explain before. Remind me if the last few minutes if I haven't explained it. Okay. All right. So what I want to do is, so that's the story, and I think the story is important. First, it's good Jewish knowledge and Jewish history. When kids learn about Purim in school, often it's hard for them to grasp the sequence of events because, historical sequence is something you do when you're a bit older. But that is the story. Interestingly enough, by the way, there's a custom. It's only a custom. Not all people don't do this, but there's a custom that some people on the second day of Pesach, when they have their festival meal, their meal of Pesach meal, they add something, a dish, a special dish, in honor of the death of Haman. That's because it happened on the second day of Pesach. Meaning the main celebration is Purim, but some people have a little bit of extra celebration on the second day of Pesach because it's the demise of Haman. Okay, so here's five lessons first. Before we get to collective lessons as a nation, let's talk about 5 lessons from the Purim story, which we can all take away, not only as a nation, but also as individuals. And the first lesson is the source of happiness. What is the source of happiness? All right? So we've talked about this before, Tal Ben Shachar's work, where we did a whole series once where he talks about not pursuing happiness, but rather pursuing the things that bring happiness, right? But there's a very interesting verse in the Megillah. Fascinating verse. And that's why I want to tell you the story first so you get the context. After Haman was killed, and Ahasuerus said, look, I can't rescind the decree, but I could allow you to make another decree and you could fight back. Remember, this was 11 months before Purim, right? Before it actually happened. So the Jews had this on their head the entire year. And it says the word went out, and all the male people on horses went, and they delivered this thing to all the 127 provinces. And it says, La Yudim Haita Ora V'Simcha. The Jews had light and joy. They celebrated. And they had real joy. And the obvious question is, what do you mean they had real joy? They weren't out of the woods. They weren't free from challenge, right? This is right after Pesach when they get to know that Haman's gone and to fight back, but fighting back is a war. It's a tricky thing. And yet it says, La Yudim Haita Ora V'Simcha. They had light and they had joy. And they celebrated. Why? Because it goes to the heart of what joy really is and happiness really is, right? One of the greatest, we've talked about this so many times, but it comes out so clearly in the Megillah, because one of the great sources of joy is having meaning and purpose. The story of Purim, right? The story of Purim is a story where the Jews actually had lost their way. They'd assimilated, they'd lost their way, they had lost their connection from God. They had decided to trust the regime they were under, which is part of the whole story of the banquet. They all thought that would be their There will be the salvation. They thought Achashverosh and his government would be the answer to all their problems. Governments are never answers to anyone's problems. We need them. We need advocacy. But that was a mistake. They'd forgotten their unique relationship with God. And the decree came about. And they took it as a reminder. They took it as a call to action. And as we'll see later, when Esther went to the king, she said, look, what you really need is, I'm going to go to the king and I'm going to intercede, but what you really need is you need to regroup and you need to reconnect, which is what they did. Mordechai led the charge. Mordechai led the Jewish people. They gathered, they fasted, they made great prayer groups. They did a lot of learning of Torah, especially with children, it says. And the tide started to change. As soon as the tide started to change, they were given this clarity. What's very interesting is the Pasuk says the Jews had Orav v'simcha, light and joy. Joy comes after light because you need clarity, you need direction, you need purpose, you need guidance, you need a focus. The Jews suddenly had a focus. They weren't out of the woods, they were still under challenge, they still had a war to fight, but they had understood where they had gone wrong. They understood what the meaning of life is. They understood what they need to do. Suddenly had this amazing clarity. And once they had amazing clarity, that was enough to achieve happiness. Right? That was enough to achieve happiness, and they celebrated. They celebrated with faith, they celebrated with confidence. Of course they prepared for war, and they fought the war, and they won the war. But they already started celebrating before that, because happiness doesn't always come, inner happiness, real happiness, doesn't come from what happens outside of us. It comes from what happens within us. And that's when they understood that focus. They had aura, they had light, meaning that clarity, that moral clarity, that reconnected, that's when the happiness came. And that was the true happiness. We were able to celebrate, notwithstanding that they still had a war to fight. Of course, the other lesson we talk about Purim being the source of happiness, because our sources tell us that Purim Day actually is a source of happiness in general. It brings down tremendous blessing for happiness. That's why when we celebrate Purim, we draw down that energy, right? That we know that one of the other sources of happiness is connecting with other people. Connection, right? We know that. That's why the Purim mitzvot, obviously we listen to the Megillah, that's one mitzvah. Towards the end of Purim we have a festive meal, but the two easy mitzvot to do on Purim are the mishloach manot, sending food gifts to others, that's the idea of increasing friendship, but also matanot la'evyanim, which is to designate some money for those in need, right? To give to those in need, those who are poor, those in need, who are in financial hardship. And the Rambam says an interesting thing. He says, there's a minimum of how much mishloach manot you have to give. You have to give at least to one person, 2 kinds of food. Then there's also matanot levinim. You're supposed to give money or a gift to at least 2 different needy people. And then you can give more. Some people give more. They give many mishloach manot as they want. You can give to more than 2 people. But he says, the Rambam says that if you're going to increase in one of the mitzvot, the best one to increase it is matanot le'evyanim, to do more than the minimum, gifts for the poor. He says, why? He says an amazing line, which of course in modern literature is so well found and so well researched, but the Rambam says it many, many, many hundreds of years ago. And he says, because there is no greater joy than bringing joy to those that need it the most. Right? That's what the Rambam says. That's the source of real joy. Right? People who pursue pleasure, which pleasure is so different from joy, as we've spoken about many, many times, sometimes hold back from giving because it's about them, it's self-absorption, so they're pursuing pleasure that works for them. That brings pleasure, doesn't bring joy. It leaves, after the pleasure, which is transient, goes away, there's a hole that's left and an emptiness that's left. True joy comes from giving. True joy comes from giving to others. And therefore the Rambam says there's no greater joy than helping those that need it the most, and includes people that are emotionally upset and have grieving or whatever the case, all different types of people that need it. Helping them brings the greatest joy. What's interesting also is a very fascinating thing, just again drawing it from the Purim story. When Haman came to Achashverosh, right, and he told him that he wants to make a decree to kill all the Jews, and Achashverosh agreed. He said, why did he agree? Because Achashverosh was an anti-Semite, just like Haman, just was not quite as open. There's 2 kinds of anti-Semites, the one that say it out loud and the one that don't. Yeah, he was actually quite happy. No, the reason that he didn't come up with it, I'm going to get to it. The reason why he didn't come up with it, so Haman was much more cunning and clever than Achashverosh was. The Talmud says Achashverosh tipesh haya. He was a fool. He was a madman, he was a fool. Right? Huh? Okay, let's look at political. So Achashverosh didn't come up with things. Achashverosh was actually scared to start up with the Jews. He said, the consequence of starting with the Jews is a dangerous thing at the end of the day. And that much he knew. But Haman persuaded him. Why did he persuade him? He said two things to him. If you look at the words of the Megillah in the Hebrew, it's very exact. He came to Achashverosh and he says, Yeshno am echad. There is a nation, referring to the Jews, which in Hebrew was a very funny word to say, Yeshno. In Hebrew we say yesh am echad, right? There is. But there's a way of saying in classical Hebrew you can say yeshno. And the Talmud says, why did he say yeshno? Because he said yashnu, they went to sleep. They're no longer spiritually connected. You don't have to worry about them. God has abandoned them. Number one. Then he went on and he said something very powerful in the context of what I've just explained, and he says the following. He says, there's this one nation, mefuzar u'meforad beino amim. They are scattered and separate among the nations. What did he really mean to say? He didn't mean to say that they're all over wherever one of your countries is, you can find them. He says, no. Mefuzar, they are divided. They're not united. And I'm telling you, he says to Achashverosh, if they're not united, they're vulnerable. They've lost their power. The power of connection, the power of unity is such an important thing. A, it brings happiness. B, it brings strength. Haman knew this, and he said to Achashverosh, Yeshno am echad. First of all, they've gone to sleep, spiritually speaking. But second of all, more importantly, mefuzar, they scattered. They divided. Mefurad, pirud means separation. Disunited. And there shouldn't be any problem getting them. What he didn't understand was, he didn't understand the ultimate power of the Jew. The ultimate power of the Jew, that when push comes to shove, sometimes we need to be pushed, but we understand the lesson, we get the call. And the Jews united. That's why in Purim, right? That's why in Purim, the mitzvot of Purim have a lot to do with connection. Giving food to others, giving gifts, right? I'll just share with you a thing I just saw this year, actually, how this is so brought up in the whole story. There's a beautiful midrash that says like this. There's a mitzvah that was performed in temple times. It was a yearly tax called machatzit hashekel, to give half a shekel every year. A shekel was a silver coin. So there was this thing that once a year, during Adar actually, before the story of Purim, during this month, the Jews used to have to give to the temple a half a shekel, which everyone had to give a half a shekel, not more, not less. And that particular tax was used to buy the animals for the sacrifices in the temple, whatever the case is. But the Torah is very clear that it has to be a yearly thing, and it's machatzit, it has to be specifically a half a shekel. When Haman came, Haman was between the two temples, there wasn't a temple then. Haman came to Achashverosh and he said, there's this nation, Mefuzar, they scattered, I want to kill them. And he says, I will add 10,000 very expensive silver coins to the king's treasury, which was another reason why he persuaded Achashverosh. He was very rich, Haman, and he said, I'll add 10,000 silver coins. So the Midrash says that a heavenly voice came out. There's this concept that Talmud always talks about, a heavenly voice, which not always our consciousness can hear, but on a spiritual level, it comes out and came out and said that you're not going to succeed, Haman. Why? Because the Jews' shekels came before your shekels. They already have the mitzvah of machatzit shekel, of half a shekel. And they've been giving this throughout the whole temple time. And now you're coming and offering silver coins. Their silver coins came before your silver coins. But what does that actually mean? So they gave coins, you give coins. What does that mean? So I saw one of the commentaries says the following. That why did God tell us to give half a shekel? Why half a shekel? Why not a whole shekel? Why not a quarter shekel? The half a shekel was to remind, and you're not allowed to give more. You put this particular tax. Of course, you can give more to other things, but this particular tax was a half a shekel. Once a year, every Jew had to donate a half a shekel. Why? Because God wanted to remind us that we need to understand that on our own, we're only half. Always. Every Jew is only half on their own. It's when everyone gives machatzit shekel together, then the coins join and two halves become one whole. So the machatzit shekel was this reminder that you cannot be alone. You cannot be disconnected from others. You have to be connected. And that's why, ultimately, even though the Jews at the time of the Purim story were a bit disconnected. It's true, Haman was correct. But they had already been given the half a shekel, they already knew the lesson, and they knew that intrinsically they are connected. And when they need to, they will band together, and they did. And therefore, because the Jews have been reminded and been given this mitzvah of half a shekel for so many centuries already, they were ready to fight back and to reignite themselves and to remind themselves of the power of unity and the power of that you're only half on your own and come together, and ultimately they're coming together. As Esther told Mordechai before she went to the king, she said, Lech kenos, go gather the Jews. The word kinus means together. When you gather together and you pray together and you work together and you help each other, and then I'm going to go and ask the king to help us, because the power of unity will be the key to fight back. Okay. The other story of Purim is, and this is such an important story in our own lives and collectively as a nation and everything that happens to us, and that's the message of hope, right? You have to understand, the decree of Haman at the time was an unbelievable decree. There are times throughout Jewish history where Jews were under threat in one country, but Jews were free in other countries, right? They can support them, they can come to their aid, they can, like we know during history. In Haman's case, it was not true. Ahasuerus was the sovereign leader of most of the inhabited world at the time, 127 countries, and that's exactly where the Jews lived, throughout those 127 provinces. And when the decree came that he's going to kill the Jews on the 13th of Adar, he meant the entire nation, right? So it was a bleak time. But in general, the Purim story takes place, it's a very powerful story because it takes place in the context of extreme darkness. On all levels. Darkness. First of all, the decree was unbelievable, but even before that, the Jews were not in their homeland. The Jews were, there were people living in Israel, but they weren't under their own sovereignty. They were under Persia. They were under a foreign king. In fact, even after the story of Purim, they remained under a foreign leader for a while, until they went back to Israel. The whole story of Purim, the miracle of Purim, isn't actually miraculous. It is miraculous, but it doesn't seem miraculous. If you read the book of Esther, you'll see that one thing happens after another. No sea splits, no plagues come, nothing falls from heaven. It's actually normal, natural events. You have to analyze it, and you have to actually look carefully, and you have to see, when you put all those sequences together, you'll realize how miraculous it is. But on the surface, it's not miraculous at all. The Megillah is, we've told this many times, the Megillah is the only book of the 24 books of the Tanakh that does not have God's name in it. An entire Megillah, right? Hinted, but doesn't have God's name. Why? Because it was a time of darkness. God was concealed. It was a time of exile. There was spiritual consciousness, and divine consciousness was very low. So in that context, when the Haman's decree came along, it was like the end. It was just the end. And in minutes, right? One of the great verses of the Megillah, there's many verses, but one of the main verses of Megillah was, the Kabbalists tell us that the Megillah has to be read on two levels. The story the way it took place over here, and the story the way it was happening in heaven, parallel. One of the great verses of the Megillah is, Balaylahu, in that night, there was one night where the king couldn't sleep. That's what it said. And the halakha tells us that when the reader of the Megillah, see if you can pick it tomorrow, if you make it to the Megillah, see, I'll go around, I'll read it very fast, so you might not notice. But Balaylahu, when the reader of the Megillah reads that verse, he's supposed to read it loudly. That verse is supposed to be louder than the others, because that's considered the main part of the miracle. Why is the main part of the miracle that Ahasuerus had insomnia? Things happen from that, but what? Yeah. But they say no. When it says the king, it means the King of Kings, God. And during the story of Purim, Hashem was, so to speak, asleep. God is never asleep, but he appeared to be asleep. He appeared like, where are you? Which is the question we all ask many times. And then suddenly, Balaylahu, in that night is a symbol of darkness. In that darkness, the king woke up. And everything turned around. And everything was transformed. And the tide turned, right? So, the lesson of Purim is that we never give up hope. That's such an important thing. It's in DNA. It's the DNA of being a Jew is not to give up hope. Why? Because when we see darkness, we know that underneath the darkness, there's light. That's one of the reasons why there's a custom to dress up. If you watched my little videos today, that because when people dress up, what you see is not what there is. It looks like a different person, but you have to know that underneath that, it's a real person, right? I've told the story before. I remember listening, thinking about this once when Dina and I once went on a bit of a break to the Blue Mountains. Blue Mountains, beautiful. The air is fantastic. And we woke up in the morning. We were going to take a walk, and we went outside, and there was an unbelievable fog. I think I've told the story before. Unbelievable fog, and we thought, I can't even see anything. So you know what? We can see 5 meters ahead. So let's go. And I noticed the interesting thing that every time you took a few steps, you could still see ahead, right? You still see. The fog is very nice. It looks very dark, but it's actually not there. It's very thin, right? And then after about 10, 15 minutes walking, we kept walking. Suddenly the fog lifted, and the beautiful, majestic mountains of the Blue Mountains, it's a beautiful place, right? Suddenly appeared. And I thought to myself, the Baal Shem Tov says, from everything you have to learn a lesson, right? So this is the lesson. Sometimes we see something, we see darkness, it's just a fog. It might seem very dark, it might seem very bleak, but it's a fog. It will lift. And when it lifts, you'll see the majesty, you'll see the beauty. And that's really the story of Purim. Sometimes we have to do something for it. We have to make an effort. We have to reconnect. We have to reflect. We have to do something good, whatever it is. But the fact is, there's always hope, right? We know that Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish nation, are here forever. We're here forever. We're an eternal nation. We're not going anywhere, right? All the nations that tried to destroy us have come and gone. We are still here, miraculously, as we know. But sometimes it looks dark, as it does nowadays, as it does sometimes in our own life. And sometimes it's very tempting. The reason why it's very tempting is because it's an escape to give up hope. Giving up hope is an escape. You just give up hope, you lift up your hands and say, that's it. It's gone, it's finished, it's all over. But as the story of the Purim story tells us is that we can never ever give up hope. Because the darkness is just a dress up. Underneath the dress up is the real person. A fourth lesson from Purim is using challenge for strength. So there's a famous line in the Talmud, which doesn't have to be taken always 100% literally in its literal application, but it says that on Purim there's a mitzvah to drink. Right? You know that? Yeah. Obviously people have to be careful and have to be responsible, and everyone has to know if they drink what it's going to lead to and so on. But okay. But it does say that. It's the only time it says it's actually a mitzvah to become intoxicated. And it says the word in the word of the Talmud is libisume, which commentator Rashi on the Talmud says, he translates it as to drink wine specifically. Now, not everyone does that. That's different customs. Some people like their whiskey better than their wine, but there's this emphasis on wine. Why is emphasis on wine? Because if you look at the story of Purim, there's a big connection with wine. First of all, the Megillah, the story of Purim opens up with a story of wine. Ahasuerus runs this party, and it's a banquet. And in the Megillah, for some reason, there's a big emphasis on the kinds of vintage wines that he was able to sell, able to give to the people at the banquet, right? It says that he gave wine. He was so wealthy and he was so powerful that he was able to give each person wine according to their age. So yeah, that's what it says. Each person, the waiter would ask, the bartender or whatever it was, would ask them the age. Maybe some people would lie, but then there was a problem because they wouldn't get a good wine then, right? But if they were older, they got vintage wine according to the age. A whole thing about wine. Later on, Esther, when she wants to save the Jewish people, wine. She invites Ahasuerus and Haman to the party, to a private banquet. Again, they were drinking, right? So there's a lot of emphasis on wine, and then we get told that it's a mitzvah to drink wine on Purim. What's the concept of why wine? What's the emphasis on wine? So again, the same idea. What did the Jews do when they were challenged, right? They didn't give up hope, but they did spring into action. They reconnected. They became stronger. They rediscovered their Jewishness. They rediscovered who they were. They rediscovered their strength. They rediscovered their connection with God, right? Wine is a very interesting beverage. I think it's the one beverage from time immemorial that has significance and has prominence, right? I don't think there's any society that doesn't value wine, right? It's an interesting thing. Other alcohol drinks come and go, but wine is like now in Judaism, we know we consider it a very important beverage, right? We make kiddush on wine. We make a blessing under the chuppah on wine. A bris has wine. Havdalah, so many things have wine, right? It's considered Pesach, when we celebrate the Exodus of Egypt, 4 cups of wine. So what's the idea of wine? Why is it so important? So wine comes from a grape, right? A grape is just a fruit. It's like a regular fruit. We have blessings on food, right? So when you eat a grape, what would be the blessing? The blessing would be Barei Pri Ha'etz. We praise God for making the fruit of the tree. Okay? Suddenly you take a grape and you produce wine, and suddenly it's a whole new level. What comes out of the grape, it's not just like orange juice that comes from orange juice, or grape juice which comes from a grape. This is wine. Wine is different. Wine has a certain importance. It now has a new blessing. It's a different blessing you make it. You make Barei Pri Hagafen and use it for important things, and you praise God over it, and all these things, right? What happened? How did the juice come out of the grape? So like the thing goes, you have to kvetch the grape a little bit. Right? You have to press the grape a little bit. When you press the grape, you produce amazing beverage. When we face challenge, this is the story of Purim, which we learn from how they responded to the challenge. When we are challenged, and we also, like I say always, we always pray to God that we shouldn't be challenged. But if we are challenged, we need to understand that the challenge is an opportunity. And that's what they saw in the story of Purim. The challenge is we are like an olive. And when we get challenged, we're being kvetched. And when an olive is squeezed, it produces something amazing. And that's the story of Purim. And that's why there's this association with wine, and even the mitzvah, according to many halachic authorities, to drink on Purim, but specifically wine. Because wine is this prominent beverage that comes when the grape is squeezed. And although it's not so easy to do this, but this is something that we have to always try and remember, that while we wait for the light to come after the darkness, we're going through the process of being kvetched, but we're going to produce wine even stronger and become stronger than we were before. Can we get the little air? Thanks. Okay. One last lesson before we go to collectively, I think what's so important to know from Purim. I think that's good. It should be okay. And that is, I want to just note one sort of side lesson to learn from the story of Purim is to recognize the miracle in our life. I said before, I made a mention before quickly, that the Purim story doesn't seem that miraculous, right? But if you actually analyze the story of Purim, it's amazingly miraculous. The way things fall in place, and one person happened to hear from someone else, and Mordechai heard two people plotting against the king, and he saved the king because of that. He happened to be there, and he reported to the king, and that's why his thing was recorded, and then the king forgot to reward him, and later when he got a bit nervous with Haman, he told... The whole story is a unbelievable puzzle that just sort of falls into place. Nothing about it is miraculous. Each event is not miraculous on its own right, but if you put them all together, you see that actually it's an unbelievable story, and it's a miraculous story. We call it in Hebrew, Nes Melubash Beteva. It's a miracle which is hidden in nature. Right? Nature is the routine of life. The truth is, nature is also a miracle. Just because something happens every day, just because the sun comes up every day, doesn't make it less miraculous than when God split the sea when the Jews left Egypt. This is something Nachmanides points out. Right? That everything is miraculous. Okay, but nevertheless, nature we get used to and we expect it to happen. Yeah.
How long did the Purim story take?
It was about over 11 years, the whole Purim story. From the beginning of the Megillah until the end. It takes about, I think it's 11 years, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. I mean, we read it in 20 minutes, but it took 11 years, yeah. No, because until the banquet, and then until Haman and Haman's rise to power, until he came to the king, it was all took place over time, yeah. It wasn't just a quick...
It's also quite amazing that King Ahasuerus just simply said, hey, no, you're getting killed.
Yeah,
It
no.
was an anti-Semite.
Exactly, everything turned around. It was amazing, yeah. It was an amazing miracle. And I think the lesson for us is that we need to, sometimes, I've said this before, but we need to recognize the miracles in our own life. Sometimes we look at our life, it's going a bit boring. In fact, we have a few challenges and nothing major happening. It's gratitude, the power of gratitude. We have to sit down sometimes, just reflect about the amazing blessings and amazing miracles that do happen in our lives. Everyone has those miracles, those moments, those blessings, and we have to be able to notice it. Okay. I wanted to finish off with two lessons as a nation, and so relevant to what we're going through now. The Talmud says an amazing thing. The Talmud says, why did God allow the decree to come upon the Jewish people? Now normally it's not for us to explain what God does, and we don't do that. Unless great people like great prophets or tremendous people who understand these things are able to do that. So in the particular story of Purim, the Talmud says, because they enjoyed the banquet of Achashverosh. They went and they enjoyed it. So obviously all the commentaries ask, First of all, the Medrash says that the banquet was kosher. Because Achashverosh wanted everyone to enjoy it, so he says, whatever hechsher, whatever kashrut you need, you can come. This one needs something else, they can come. Everyone was taken care of. So it's really strange, right? So then what was the problem? What was the problem with them going to the banquet? And the problem was a much deeper problem. The Bavitch Rebbe once explained this, and it's a beautiful idea, and I think it's such an important lesson for us as well. We have mentioned this idea before, but I want to just put it into the context of Purim. Going to the party wasn't such a big avera, wasn't such a big transgression. It was the fact that the Jews had become completely dependent and reliant on Achashverosh, and they thought that was the answer to their purpose. What does that mean? There's this expression in the Talmud about the Jewish people that shows us that who are we, right? We need to understand who we are. What's the essence of the Jewish nation? The essence of the Jewish nation is an existence which is miraculous. Because the Talmud says we are kifsa achat, we're like one lamb among 70 wolves. Anti-Semitism didn't start today, as we know. Right? We're like one lamb among 70 wolves. And yet we're still here. Why are we still here? Because we have this incredible hashgacha, we have this incredible care that God gives us, and He keeps us existing eternally and miraculously. Right? But what we need to do, and this is always important, and important now also, more important now in a way, we have to remember why we still exist and strengthen that why. Right? So the Talmud, so the Rebbe explained that when the Talmud says that they went to the banquet of Achashverosh and they enjoyed it and they really relied on it, Haman was able to make such a decree. It wasn't a punishment. It was a natural consequence. God says, you think your survival will come because you rely on the government? You think it's going to come because Achashverosh is there? And then later they thought maybe Esther is there and she's Jewish, even better. Right? If you want to survive by nature, go ahead, try it out. Go ahead. See how it works for you. That's what he said. It wasn't a punishment. He said, you have to understand, you as a nation, you exist, you can't exist naturally. You need to do natural things, but you can't exist because of nature. And if you get so immersed to the point that you thought this was like the most amazing thing that you got invited to the king's palace, and therefore now you big macha and you sort of pals with the king, you know him on their first name, you know his mobile number, whatever the case is, you know who to call, you know which you think that's what's going to keep you alive? Try it and see what happens. And that's exactly what happened. So then what happens is, Esther knew this well and Mordechai knew it well, but Mordechai comes to Esther and says, listen, there's a decree. And the decree is, you need to use diplomacy. You need to go talk to the king. But Esther says to him, you've forgotten something. Not forgotten, he says, but let me remind you. That's what got us into the hot water in the first place. Of course you have to go to the king. But it's got to be secondary. It's got to be after you understand who you really are. So she says, I'm not going to the king today. Take the Jewish people and gather them in Shushan, she says in the Megillah, let them fast and pray and reconnect with their Jewishness. Right? And understand they have to be confident, they have to be proud, and they have to develop their pride of being Jewish. You know, the story tells us one of the things that it seems to be in the Megillah is that the decree came about because Haman got so angry because Mordechai wouldn't bow down to him. But if you look at the Megillah deeply, that's not actually what got the decree. Actually, that's what brought the salvation. It's just the problem was he was the only one that wouldn't bow down. Right? The salvation, the decree came because they started to rely on Haman and Achashverosh. They bowed down to him. They thought he's the answer. If we can get close to him, he's the answer. And it's not the answer. So Esther says, first let them do the main thing. Let them reconnect to who they are. Let them be proud Jews. Let them connect to their Jewishness. Let them do something Jewish. Let them learn. Let them do another mitzvah. Let them grow Jewishly. And after they make that commitment to do that, which they did, then I'll do the diplomacy. I'll go to Achashverosh. It's a risky thing, because the Megillah says that you haven't been summoned to the king in those days. You had to be summoned. I haven't been summoned for a long time. He could just be angry with me and kill me. But I know that if the Jews connect, then the diplomacy will work.
Did he know she was Jewish?
No.
I wonder how he felt when she told him, I'm Jewish.
Yeah, but then he turned around miraculously and he became big friends with Mordechai. And then Mordechai became a big mach in the government also. But that was the thing. And I think it's such an important thing to understand nowadays. Of course we need diplomacy. We've said this before, and of course we need good government, and of course we need everything, and we should do that. But we shouldn't forget what the main thing is. Right? When we see a challenge, when we're under threat, Israel here, all over the world, we're all one people, so we should be. We're all under threat. We have to not lose hope, first of all, as we said before, and second of all, we have to keep strengthening who we are. To be proud Jews. Not to bow down, not to be subservient, to stand up strong and say we are who we are. We're not embarrassed, we are, and we're going to show what we are by strengthening that Jewishness and that Jewish pride. And then the diplomacy, God wants us to operate within nature. Of course He wants us to do that. We need an army, we need diplomacy, we need everything. But that's at the end. We need what really is important. We see from the Purim story is gather together, bind together, come together Jewishly and strengthen our Judaism, each one in their own way. And as the second thing is, and what actually happens there, and this is interesting, the Megillah says that when Haman was killed, and when the decree was not rescinded, but another decree was added that the Jews could fight back, and the Jews felt pride, and they'd reconnected to their Jewishness, during that year, as we said, the challenge wasn't over. But one thing that did happen was that it says, "V'rabim me'hamei haaretz," many of the non-people actually came over to the Jewish side. Whether it means actually converted or they came over, whatever. I mean, we don't look for converts, but it means they came over to the Jewish side. Why? Because another lesson we know from Jewish history is that respect, and generally this is true, respect comes from being proud of who you are. When you falter, when you're insecure, when you bow down, when you start compromising, because I don't know, we have to be careful. We're living somewhere else. We're not in Israel. We're not in Mea Shearim. We're in Sydney. All this kind of stuff. Obviously, we have to be responsible. I'm not. I was in a lift the other day coming out of a hospital. I was in a hospital visiting someone, and I came out and someone stopped me in the middle of the elevator. She said, "Oh, I guess I look Jewish, right?" So I have my tzitzis, my hat. I don't know. She goes, "Oh, you do that even out of shul?" And I don't even know what she wanted. It took me a minute actually. Now, I'm not going to Lekemba like that, but in London, I know there's some people who wear a cap when they go to some areas. Obviously, you have to be responsible, but the feeling has to be, no, I'm not backing down. We're not backing down from going to shul. We're not backing down from doing mitzvah, and we're not backing down from being proud of who we are. I think I don't know if I told you this, but a few weeks ago it was amazing. Mr. Goldschmidt from Gold's Bookstore told me, which is beautiful. I was so inspired by that. He said that in the last year he's sold more chai necklaces than he's ever sold, which is beautiful because we're not ashamed. But that's a translating this to how we observe and how we engage with Jewishness. We have to engage more. We have to learn more. We have to do another mitzvah once in a while. We have to just try and be as Jewish as we can because that's the answer to our survival. So those are some of the lessons of Purim. But the way we connect to the energy of Purim is by connecting to the day, like all the festivals of the Jewish calendar. We connect to the day. The way we connect to the day is by doing the things that we need to do on the day. We are taught that when we engage with Purim and we do it in a celebratory way, we draw down blessing and simcha for the whole year. So now that this Purim is even more important in that way, so we'd have to really connect with it as much as we can. So once again, I invite you all to Breedy's house tomorrow in Vaucluse. We'll do a quick Megillah reading. We'll do some of the mitzvot. We'll celebrate and we'll share some more Purim insights. Have a wonderful day and a Purim Sameach. Welcome. Good to see you.
Not me, I can't.
All the best. Purim Sameach.
Yes.
No, Purim Sameach.
Thank you very much. It's amazing.
But there wasn't another landing, there wasn't another time. So I waited until the end of the school, before the end of the and you know, now they don't have thank you. No, you're fine. I yesterday at 3 o'clock. Think they
I'm really sorry, Anne, that I missed your evening. You know, really sort of pictures that you gave, and I'm sorry. We missed you too. Thank you. We'll enjoy the time together.
Thank you. It comes round too fast.
Just show us what you informed you guys.